Hello, everyone. Let me start with a short self-introduction, where I'm coming from, why I'm here, what is my background and agenda. Kharkiv is the second largest city in Ukraine, almost on the Russian border, Russian-speaking and European skeptical. How can I?
Use arrow keys.
Like that, yeah? Good. It didn't prevent its main university from being the most high-ranked internationally among Ukrainian ones for many years in a row. Maybe I need help. Yeah, like that, yeah? Okay. It also didn't prevent Kharkiv from failing the expectations of becoming the center of pro-Russia secession after the Euromaidan in 2014. It's the former temporary capital of Soviet Ukraine a century ago, an industrial, educational, cultural, business trade center. Multiple and blurring identities, typical borderland. It's where I came from, it's the city where I was born and lived all my life. Kharkiv University is where I worked for 18 years. My latest position there was a professor of the journalism department. Me and my wife never thought about migrating. We had everything there. Favorite jobs? My wife taught me medicine in the same uni. Spatial flat, close-knit family. We have an 11-year-old boy. Church network of friendship, trust and care. Sports, mountain hiking, marathon, triathlon. News editing for a small TV channel. And books. All of it has been subverted by the Russian invasion in early 2022. My family moved to Poland, then to the Netherlands, and ended in the UK under the Homes for Ukraine scheme. I stayed for a year in Lviv in the west of Ukraine and managed to cross the border in December on academic exchange. The UK university that invited me failed to secure funding. I wasn't upset, as I was able to leave the war zone, reunite with my family, and get international experience. Happily, continued bombing of UK universities with my application drew the attention of Ilya Yablokov. He recommended me to address several organizations for funding. CARA, the Council for At-Risk Academics, gave me a 2-year scholarship at the University of Sheffield. I'm thrilled to use this chance to the fullest. My research topic is perception of the West amongst Ukrainian refugees in the EU, preliminary observations. Now I want to present the contents of the theoretical stage of my research so far. No field work is done yet. One of the reasons for this talk is to open the discussion. Getting to know that I'm from Ukraine, people from the global south in recent times tend to ask me, is it calm in Ukraine already? Has the conflict been settled? The answer is a resounding no. Russia is on offensive, and the plans to capture Kharkiv are now a commonplace in Russia's own news. The Kharkiv infrastructure is badly damaged by the missile attacks. Blackouts are again and on there. The daily routine is disrupted. Businesses and institutions suffer. Civilians perish. Ukrainian army reports to be out of ammunition. What is worse, Ukrainians remain divided on the issue of Russia. Westernization in our part of the world, which is Eastern Europe, is identical with modernization, maintains a renowned Ukrainian historian. Many Ukrainians are confused by Russia's claims that A. Modernization during the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union was accomplished without Western resources and help, and B. The unprecedented state terror and violations of human and civil rights during this time were insignificant and even necessary. Russia tries to credit every victory only for itself. It ignores and silences its constant dependency on Western technologies, knowledge, and money. What is the place of Ukraine in Russia's geopolitical picture? This issue goes back at least to the 17th century. This was the time when the Tsardom of Russia transformed into a sizable European power. Its westward conquests allowed it to incorporate large territories with peoples who were religiously, culturally, and ethnically similar to Russia. These territories later become today's Ukrainian Belarus. For centuries, Russia has been declaring the eternal unity of these three nations in its imperial body and suppressing any divergences and differences. In this logic, sharing a common past predestines a common future as well. Ukraine is allegedly doomed. It will either flourish, having dissolved into the Russian civilizational nation state, or betray Russia and perish alongside with the decadent and degenerate West. This is the way of thinking of the Russian white immigrant philosophers who constitute the chosen reading of Vladimir Putin. In some aspects, such thinking is even way more radical and less tolerant towards Ukraine than the one that constituted the official Soviet ideology. In the early 20th century, Ukraine underwent a national revolution and born a range of disparate political forces. Its attempts to sustain independence failed, but they were not in vain. Soviet Russia got a clear signal. Its leader, Vladimir Lenin, made wide concessions to Ukraine, including recognition of its ethnicity, language, and traits of cultural and administrative autonomy. In the Soviet era, large provinces were added to what became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. These lands had the majority of ethnic Ukrainians, with the latest and only exception, Crimea. Soviet modernization was fast and furious. It produced overwhelming results and took millions of lives. Since then, the Soviet narrative has been the most dividing in Ukraine. It's a litmus test of someone's geopolitical optics. Ukrainians abound on every side of this divide. Alongside ethnic Russians, they were admitted to the highest ranks of the Communist Party hierarchy. The premise for this was Sovietization, accepting the notion of a shared Soviet mentality, post-ethnic and classless society, Russian language and culture. This opened access to a huge labor market, professional mobility, and social lifts. At the same time, many Ukrainians vehemently opposed Sovietization. They formed a numerous and vocal diaspora, religious and nationalist underground. At the end of the day, the Soviet project seemed to prevail. In the 1980s, Ukrainians were massively assimilated and Russified. Milan Kundera wrote in 1984, quote, "One of the great European nations, there are nearly 40 million Ukrainians, is slowly disappearing. And this enormous, almost unbelievable event is occurring without the world realizing it." And then the Soviet Union began crumbling. The hopes for state independence reignited the ethnic conscience in millions of Sovietized Russian-speaking Ukrainians. In 1991, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus leaders signed an agreement that officially dissolved the Soviet Union. The reason was a deep economic crisis that engulfed these lands. Nevertheless, politically, Russia never meant to let Ukraine go. Immediately, Russia's territorial claims to Ukraine emerged. These are just some of the key preceding events. Ukraine declared independence in 1990. Very soon, two attempts to violate Ukraine's territorial integrity happened. Both failed at the time. and then two revolutions organized by the fledgling middle class in Ukraine, which were meant to orient Ukraine towards the West. And the most important stage here for us happened in 2014, when President of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted and fled to Russia. The new pro-Western government was installed. Russia annexed Crimea, and the Donbas War started. The Euromaidan, which is the second revolution, which is called Euromaidan or the Revolution of Dignity, and ousting of the pro-Russia president of Ukraine caused fear and loathing in Moscow. The effects of the Revolution of Dignity in Kyiv will continue to be felt by Russian citizens and their authorities for years, states Ilya Yablok. The Kremlin seems to have realized that playing a passive role in global events could threaten the regime's survival, and so has made it clear that it is prepared to protect its interests at all costs. Russia's propaganda and disinformation machine never stood idle. Remember KGB's active measures doctrine. But now it started to target Ukraine 24/7. The Sputnik news agency was launched in 2014, obviously reacting to the developments in Ukraine. RT, Russia Today TV channel, was in place then for almost a decade. The means of Russia's soft power in Ukraine at that time were media and political forces. Among the latter was Viktor Medvedchuk, an oppositional politician with unofficial ownership of 3 TV channels. The main political force at that time was the oppositional platform For Life. Ukraine's response contained multiple limitations and bans of Russian media and the attempts to create Ukrainian pro-Kiev, Western-oriented alternatives. Indeed, pro-Russia Ukrainians sometimes learned ways of avoiding these bans. What were the main points of Russia's propaganda and disinformation during the previous militant decade? Politics. Ukraine is a failed state. Every Ukrainian government since the Euromaidan has been delegitimized by the Kremlin's mouthpieces. Identity wars. Ukraine is an illusion. Actually, Ukraine is Russia, which owns, controls it, and has the right to punish it. Culture, language, religion are either used to prove the Russian origins of everything or be negated. Economy. Ukraine is derivative and dependent on Russia. For decades, Russia's media prophesied that in the current winter, and this same narrative is being repeated yearly, rebellious Ukrainians are going to starve and freeze to death. Russia waged multiple gas wars as political blackmail in 1993, 95, 98, 2004, 2005 to 6, 8 to 9, 13 to 14, 14 to 18, using pricing and threats to stop transporting gas to Ukraine in exchange for political concessions to Russia. Military. Ukraine is an aggressive state, and Russia is a guarantor of peace and stability in the region. Russian speakers in Ukraine are portrayed as an endangered political minority. Defense of their rights is used as a justification for any intervention up to military invasion. Memory wars here weaponize history. The most controversial figures from both sides are Joseph Stalin and Stepan Bandera. They both happened to be Hitler's allies at almost the very same time. Both saw violence as the necessary means of achieving their goals. Both were revolutionaries and radicals. Stalin was the father of the Soviet Union proper. He is praised for rapid modernization and victory over Nazis. He is vilified, though, for massive state terror war against his own population. Bandera was one of the leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN. This political movement became known for its strong emphasis on armed struggle and self-dependence of Ukrainian cause. It was Bandera's wing of the OUN that during World War II founded the Ukrainian insurgent army and fought against Nazis and Soviets alike. These narratives aim at sowing chaos, overwhelming, dividing, and polarizing society. As a result of the Russian aggression of 2022, many Ukrainians left the country. 1.2 million went to Russia. 4.2 million fled to the EU. The latter mostly stay in Germany, which comprises 30% of the total figure, Poland, 23%, and Czechia, almost 10%. These forced migrants in the EU are in a volatile situation. Their uncertain fate depends on many developments in Ukraine, the EU, the US, and Russia at me. The push factor is the protracted war. The pull factor is the 3-year temporary protection directive enacted for the first time since its adoption in 2001. Besides the tragic circumstances they find themselves in, these people still could be prone to Russia's disinformation campaigns, and not only on Russia-related issues. As Russia regards the EU to be its third gravest enemy after the US and NATO, Ukrainian forced migrants will certainly be constantly targeted by its disinformation campaigns. Why? Because Russia has decided that it has vital interests in Ukraine, and the West has decided that it does not, claim Ara and Driscoll. For more than 2 years, these millions of Ukrainians are experiencing unprecedented hospitality from the EU. They see the bright side of Europe and enjoy most of the rights available and opportunities available for the EU citizens. They appear in the spotlight on international media. It is of Russia's strategic interest either to convert them into the fold of its sympathizers, or to at least to silence their voice for Western, Russian, and Ukrainian audiences. Along with this, forced migration and the precarious condition of these people make them vulnerable toward disinformation campaigns. Most of them still didn't master the languages of hosting countries, which means they are feeding on personal contacts, rumors, and social media instead of official sources and quality news outlets. They still have us versus them mentality, experience culture shock, and justify lack of integration efforts by their confidence in Ukraine's soon victory and their return home. But studies show that a huge share of refugees actually never return, and time plays against them. Now it makes sense to look at how other diasporas in the EU become the object of manipulation by external forces. Inclusion of different diasporas into the European home stumbles upon serious obstacles. Shall Europe become a new melting pot? It seems unlikely, as the nation states retain their power and capitalize on cultural distinctiveness in the tourism industry in particular. Can we talk about some kind of pan-European or trans-European identity? Is United Europe a new empire accepting different peoples and cultures within its midst? The EU declares allegiance to the values of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and human rights. This creates an attractive environment for many outside of the EU, and partly explains constant waves of legal, semi, and illegal immigration. Here a question is raised: who belongs there and who does not? Shall the new levels of diversity added by the newcomers be seen as an enrichment or a threat to Europe? What is desired integration? Is it an assimilation or hopefully peaceful coexistence of irreconcilably divergent actors? The case of the current forceful migration of Ukrainians may shed some light on that matter. The post-Soviet waves of Ukrainian migrants soon become invisible in the EU. Regardless of whether we see this as an integrational success, these Ukrainians, mostly economic migrants, learn languages of the EU, find jobs, get citizenship, and buy property. They are white post-Christians. This past experience could have played a role in the readiness of the EU to accept those fleeing the war in Ukraine in 2022. Any case of impediment to integration can be weaponized. Those who don't feel accepted could be susceptible to the external influence. Do you fit in? The first type here are those diasporas whose representatives struggle to be accepted in the European home. These are blacks, less Turks, and Indians. Appearance outside of the perceived European phenotype may be the issue. There is skin color and religious attire. Muslims and to a lesser extent Judaism are the main cases. The second type are those mostly white European migrants within the EU whose governments are eager to utilize Europe's resources for their own ends. Here, analysts emphasize the ideology of nativism as a stable, fixed, predetermined identity. For instance, the Hungarian government seeks to interact with its transborder compatriots to add legitimacy and meaning to its own political stance. The third type are non-EU stakeholders. For example, Turkey and Serbia declare a positive stance toward the EU and aspire for membership. Turkey uses diaspora as a political leverage, aiming at normalization of Turkish identity in the EU. In this view, diaspora Turks are expected to act as ambassadors to the motherland. The Turkish government is trying to overrule European stereotypes toward Turks and to establish Turkish parties as a means of external political influence. Serbia is oscillating between pro-Russian and pure European vectors and has established the Turning Point program to invite its skillful diaspora to contribute to the development of the country. The most disturbing subset of this third type are external rivals, if not outright enemies of united Europe. ISIS sought to recruit fighters within the EU and to raise funds for its struggle. Russia declares the EU as degenerate and morally corrupt, perceiving its enlargement as a threat to its security policy and an incursion into the sphere of its exclusive control. The minimum level of a motherland's expectations from its diaspora in the developed countries is economic remittances. Normally, a policy of diaspora mobilization is aimed at getting cultural and political remittances as well. That is, in recruiting those expats as the motherland's ambassadors in their countries of residence and in turning its diaspora into an extension of the motherland. Let's again turn to the Ukrainian new migrants in the EU. Up to now, in most polls, these migrants declare pro-Ukrainian views and trust in the EU. It may sound reassuring, yet it was pro-Russian and Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine who suffered the most in the current invasion. Forced migrants from Ukraine might have appeared in the EU not because they, quote, vote with their feet for Western democratic values, unquote, as Western governments tend to hope, but for other various reasons. It may have been the choice of their children, and now these older people feel trapped in a culturally and politically alien environment. Their family may have just sought physical safety among the mountains, or their relatives previously dreamed about migrating to a developed country, and the invasion might have served as a trigger. They may well have their properties damaged in the hostilities, or their place of residence occupied. These circumstances don't necessarily keep them from justifying Russia and laying the blame on Kiev Nazis or the vicious West. However, it is fair to speak of these forced migrants as a new Ukrainian diaspora in the EU. They are noticeably influenced by the existing diasporic network. Decker lists consequent steps a state must do to successfully co-opt a segment of a foreign country's population. 1. Identify a receptive target group within the enemy bloc and tailor content accordingly. 2. Establish in the target group an over-reliance on objective or independent foreign news sources for information while delegitimizing ideological or biased domestic news sources. 3. Engender enthusiasm and trust for the foreign culture and disdain for the domestic culture. 4. Generate political destabilization and or physical unrest, which can serve multiple possible goals of the broadcasting country. There are already some cases of Russia's weaponization of refugees and migrants within the EU or against it. You may see this list on the screen. The second point here is the least known, because I believe you all here know about the refugee crisis and Belarus-EU border crisis, but the second one is most vital for our topic. In the 1990s, millions of former Soviet citizens repatriated through Germany as ethnic Germans and Jews. For many of them, older people in particular, the integration project failed. They still hardly speak any German and are known as Russians there. Their identity could be characterized as Soviet. They mostly orbit in the Russian-speaking communities, being confined to Russian-speaking and Russia's media and political agenda. They enjoy the EU social benefits, remaining culturally and politically non or anti-European, and massively vote for the radical right party AfD. The potential of Russia's mobilization of the social group has been demonstrated in 2016. Then Russia's media heavily capitalized on the criminal case of a Russian-speaking teen girl who was allegedly raped by Arab migrants. Later, the girl dropped her charges, and the police investigation disproved them as well. Nevertheless, Russia's extensive coverage of this case caused demonstrations in several cities of Germany, accusing Germany of tolerating and covering child abuse. It is important to note that half of the Russian Germans who have repatriated into Germany in the 1990s actually came from Ukraine. How could the newly arrived Ukrainians' attitudes toward the EU be weaponized? Here's what the existing research contains. A possible criterion of positive perception of the West, Europe, EU, could be the intention to stay in an EU member state, or at least during the Russo-Ukrainian war, and even afterwards. Life in the EU is better than in a war-torn or even post-war Ukraine. Unlike previous waves of circular labor migration from Ukraine, war refugees see economic benefits as secondary to safety and social infrastructure. Most of the advantages of European lifestyle mentioned by the refugees are related to the standard of living, comfort, consumption of goods and services, and social benefits. These are social welfare, free governmental programs of vocational training and requalification, respect for employees' rights, high quality and free education for children. It was much rarer that Ukrainian forced migrants mentioned the advantages and positive differences in the system of European values, social norms, and behavioral models. Now let's look at the variables influencing the success of integration. The closer a person is to a Ukrainian middle class, the more probable is their integration in the EU. The positive predictors of pro-Western views are younger age, higher levels of income and education, coming from center and west of Ukraine, an experience of visiting Europe, living and working abroad, Ukrainian as a preferred language, higher proficiency in European languages, moving to a hosting country farther from Ukraine, higher level of socialization, evacuation abroad in the first refugee wave at the start of the invasion rather than later, being directly affected by hostilities. The Center for Economic Strategy distributed Ukrainian refugees into 4 categories. Classical refugees, who constitute a quarter of the overall figure, are mainly middle-aged females with children. Most of them stay in Poland and Czechia in the biggest cities. They chose a hosting country because of its geographical proximity with Ukraine. Such people are poorly adapted for living abroad, have insufficient proficiency in the local languages, and seldom have friends among locals. Quasi-labor migrants, almost 30%, are the most adapted for staying abroad. The majority of them happened to go abroad before. Professionals, a group of the same size, are especially inclined to work according to their and related qualifications. The remaining 16% are people from hostilities zones. They are refugees who are not adapted to living abroad, but who are foremost eager to get adjusted to it, as they are least certain as to their return to Ukraine. These people had the biggest losses because of the war. This group is above all willing to live in little towns. Prior to the war, the majority of them worked, and they are open to new opportunities in finding a job. Another study shows that 34% of the Ukrainian refugees polled said they are satisfied with life in Europe. More than a half are rather satisfied, and 13% are dissatisfied. Now I can formulate the research question. What features of the EU could be weaponized by the Russian disinformation targeting Ukrainian forced migrants? Hypothesis 1. Failure of their own integration. Maybe the generational divide is at play here. The middle class representatives and their children are arguably the most adapted for life in Europe, whereas their parents and grandparents, should they appear in the EU, could retain their Soviet sentiment regardless of the circumstances. Hypothesis 2, blaming the West for the war in Ukraine. A variation, lagging with the aid for Ukraine and probably for provoking Russia. Here we see the motif of Ukraine being betrayed by the West. The idea is of the West's obligations toward Ukraine because of the pro-Western course of the letter, its handover of the nuclear weapons, the security assurances under the Budapest Treaty. The possible narratives for pro-Russian cooptation are the following. A. Ukrainian refugees are victims of Western expansionism, which stems from the victory in the Cold War. B. Russia forcibly defends itself. C. The West is incompatible with Ukrainian Slavic Orthodox culture, values, lifestyle. In a year's time from now, at the University of Sheffield, I plan to do field research. For this, I want to apply for a grant to make a series of semi-structured interviews with Ukrainian forced migrants in the EU. Now, I'm very much open to your comments and suggestions on how this research can be done in the most effective ways. Thank you.